Professor Massimo Pigliucci. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, today we're joined by my friend Steve Laurent Montong. How are you, Steve?
Well, I'm really really excited to talk to Professor Massimo Pigliucci. Such an
Thank you.
honor.
So yeah, Steve is a graduate student in Gajah Mada University.
Undergraduate, sorry.
Undergraduate student in Gajah Mada University. His thesis is discussing something along about what is it, Steve?
Demarcation problem.
Demarcation
Ah,
problem. It's a deep
I'm
philosophical.
somewhat familiar with that. Yes.
Oh yeah. Oh,
So
he has your
familiar.
book. So
Yep, yep.
here's your book. So you're going to be interviewed by two of us, Professor, today. I'll ask more about Stoicism, something that I know you quite well from, and while Steve will ask you more about philosophy of science.
Sounds great.
We're going to have we're going to take turns. So I will ask you, interview you for around 30 to 40 minutes, and Steve will, after that, we'll do the rest. Okay.
Sounds good.
So yeah, let's start with the first question. Um, what is Stoicism?
Yeah, it's not actually easy to kind of sort of summarize here in a few words, but basically, Stoicism is a practical philosophy of life which began in ancient Greece around the end of the 4th century BCE. The aim of Stoicism is to make us into the best kind of human being we can be. The term that the Stoics used was arete, which means excellence. So and it's often translated as virtue. So to be a virtuous human being or to be an excellent human being, to be the kind of the best human being you can be. And what does that mean? According to the Stoics, there are two marks of excellence for a human being. One is to be reasonable, to act reasonably, to act on the basis of rationality as opposed to, emotions, violence, whatever it is. And the second one is to act pro-socially, that is to act in a cooperative fashion with other people. Why would that make us a excellent human being, being rational and pro-social? This comes from the Stoic analysis of human nature. The Stoics thought that as a species of animals, we are characterized by a number of things that we share with other animals, right? We need food, drink, shelter, that sort of stuff. And that's fine. We all need that, but that we share that with every other animal species. What makes us distinct from other animal species is that we don't fly or swim fast, or we don't have particularly large muscles, we don't have big fangs, nothing like that. What we do is we make our living, so to speak, by applying our reason, our intelligence, our large brains that nature gave us to solve our problems. And we are a highly cooperative species. That is, in modern terms, we could say that the success, the evolutionary success of the human species is the result of the fact that we are large-brained social mammals. And well, if that's the nature of a human being, then according to the Stoics, to be the best human being you can be means to cultivate those two aspects, to act reasonably and to act pro-socially.
Okay. This might sound like a very ridiculous question, but how did the ancient Greek formulated those ideas? I get the feeling that the ancient Greeks are more like superstitious and always incorporate gods or any supernatural beings in their observation, while this one is quite rational all the way through. So how?
Yeah. Well, you can definitely say that. Yes, the ancient Greeks and Romans, and frankly, the ancient almost anything around the globe, were certainly superstitious people. It is certainly the case that in ancient Greece, early on, the explanation for all sorts of phenomena was always the gods. And they would always say, oh, it's bad weather today. Well, that's because this particular god got upset, or this catastrophe happened. Well, that's because these other god got upset, and so on and so forth. But then something happened around the 6th century BCE. a group of people, mostly initially in the region of Greece called Ionia, which is in modern Western Turkey, rejected that way of explaining things. They said, wait a minute, these are actually natural phenomena. If something happened in a, excuse me, if if an earthquake happens, or if somebody dies or something, these are natural phenomena. This is not the gods. It's nature that acts that way, and we are smart enough to try to figure out what exactly it's going to happen, right? And why it happens. That marked that decision, that rejection of the mythological explanations, marked the beginning of philosophy. The people that I'm talking about are known today as the pre-Socratic philosophers of ancient Ionia, Thales and Miletus, Anaximander and Anaximenes. And then immediately after that, this kind of approach spread throughout Greece, and we have a lot of pre-Socratic philosophers, Parmenides, Zeno, and so on and so forth, who all start doing what we today recognize not only as philosophy but also as science. Right? The notion that you can understand the world on the basis of naturalistic principles. Now, when the Stoics came along a few centuries later, about 3 centuries later, they were therefore building on these Ionic, sometimes this is referred as the Ionic turn, a different way of approaching things that started in the Ionian area of the world. The Stoics, and as well as other philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, and so on, they started building on this Ionian insight, and they adopted a thoroughly naturalized view of things. Now, that doesn't mean the Stoics were atheists. The Stoics did believe in a God, but God for the Stoics was the universe itself. Okay? So they referred to the whole cosmos as a God. They thought the cosmos was a living organism endowed with reason, with what they called the logos. Now, what's important here is that they were certainly wrong in the specifics, right? Modern science doesn't think that the universe is a living organism. The universe is a set of processes described by what we call the laws of nature. But the fundamental insight was that everything that happens is the result of cause and effect. There are no exceptions. In other words, there are no miracles, because exceptions to cause and effect are otherwise known as miracles. Everything is made of matter. We would say today matter and energy, but the two are interchangeable anyway, according to Einstein. So, and everything that is made of matter both has causal powers, that is, it can affect, effects on other things, and it decays and dies. And so, yes, we do have, for instance, according to the Stoics, we do have a soul, but that soul is made of matter and it dies with us. So in a sense, you're right. This is a radical departure from the mythological approach to understanding the world. It was not invented by the Stoics. It was invented by the Ionian philosophers, but the Stoics definitely built on it and made it the centerpiece of their philosophy. That's why the Stoics thought that in order to live a good life, which is a problem that falls under the province of ethics as they understood it, ethics for them was very broadly the study of how to live a good life. You need two other disciplines. You need what they call physics, but by physics they meant not what we mean today by physics, not study electrons and quantum mechanics and that sort of stuff. The word physics comes from physis, which means nature in Greek. So essentially science, what we would today call science, right? So you have to study science because that is what tells you how the world actually works. And you have to study logic, meaning good reasoning, because that's how it tells you how to reason correctly about the information you get about the world. So the Stoic approach overall was you try to understand, you use your reason to try to understand science, meaning how the world works. Try to reason correctly about that understanding, that's logic, and as a result, you get ethics. You get a good understanding of how to live a good life.
So it's not just merely a way of life. It's more like a very broad approach towards our own understanding, right?
Yes.
I get the feeling that at least how Stoicism is understood nowadays is merely just a way of life, which I think it's fair to say that it's a way of life. But I think there's something much more than just applying every lessons from the Stoics. We have to. I think there is a process like what you said earlier about have to rationalize the world around us, especially at least by my own understanding, we have to understand the context. Why did the Stoic came up with their ideas? That said, my next question is what was the situations back in third century BCE around Greece that made the Stoics came to be? What was the political situations or the national relationship between each other at that times?
Yeah, that is a very good question because it also helps us explain why Stoicism is suddenly so popular today, right? So like this is a philosophy that is more than 2,000 years old. Why is it that all of a sudden during the 21st century it sort of comes back with a roar and it's become so popular? I think it's become so popular for essentially the same reasons that it became popular back in the third and second centuries BCE. Um, the period that we're talking about is called the Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period in the history of the Mediterranean goes from the death of Alexander the Great and therefore the collapse of the Macedonian Empire, which was a time of chaos because a huge empire collapses. There's wars between different chunks of that empire, different generals that were working with Alexander tried to take control. So there is a lot of chaos going on. And the period ends with the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. That battle marked the beginning of the Roman Empire because that's when Octavian, the future first emperor Augustus, defeats the joint forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, thereby ending the Roman Civil War and essentially beginning the empire. So the period we're talking about here is a period of chaos, turmoil, major political and social changes that made the average person feel like they had no control over things, like major things were happening, and they didn't know how to deal with it because it was all of a sudden the old war was gone in a minute. It was collapsing. People had no idea what was coming next. They had to adjust very frequently, very fast. So under those circumstances, it's not surprising that people were looking for answers, for some kind of way to cope with the new situation, and that is the time when a number of philosophies, not just Stoicism, came about. Right. So we already had at that point. We already had Platonism and Aristotelianism because those belong to the classical period right before the Hellenistic one. But all of a sudden, there is an explosion of philosophical schools. There is the Stoics, the Cyrenaics, the Cynics, the Epicureans, the Skeptics, the Pyrrhonists. That there's like one after another. There was a huge explosion, and these schools were competing with each other in order to provide some kind of answers, some kind of way for people to cope with what was happening. And the answers were very different from each other, of course. For instance, if you take the distinction between Stoicism and Epicureanism, right? Epicureanism was a hedonistic philosophy, meaning a philosophy based on pleasure. And so the answer for the Epicureans was, you know what? There is a lot of chaos out there. Just retreat. Just get yourself into a secluded place, a garden, as they referred to it, together with your friends and try to weather the storm, basically. Don't get involved with social and political changes because those are all painful. They're all going to interfere with your tranquility, with your serenity. So just try to stay out essentially as much as possible. The Stoics took exactly the opposite approach. They said, you should just ride the wave. Whatever happens, it doesn't matter. You're still in control of your own decisions. Your mind is still capable of dealing with whatever comes your way. So it becomes a philosophy of resilience, right? You don't control the external events. You have nothing to do with collapses of empires, but no matter what happens, you are ready. You can be in a position of surviving and even thriving under whatever circumstances the world sends your way. So that is the situation, the cultural and historical situation under which Stoicism and other philosophies of life, as I said, arise. This, by the way, it's not unique to the Mediterranean area. At about the same time, maybe a century or two earlier, something similar happens in India with the rise of Buddhism. India also was going through major political and and social turmoil, and one of the ways to answer was the beginning of a new philosophy of life, of a new approach to life, which later became known as Buddhism. Something similar again was happening at about the same time in China with the rise of Confucianism. Same situation, major political and social turmoil, and therefore there is a philosophical answer. I mean, typically in the history of humanity, when these things happen, there are two ways that people respond. One is through religion, the other one is through philosophy. And in the cases that I'm just talking about, religions in all three cases were actually on the way down. They were less popular. We talked a few minutes ago about the fact that the Greeks had started rejecting mythological explanations. So in Greece, religion was going down. In India, the dominant religion was Hinduism, and Buddhism was in fact a response to Hinduism. It was an alternative, was providing an alternative to Hinduism. Hinduism was already very old by that time. And the same goes with Confucianism, which was a non-religious response to what had happened before in Chinese history. So now move to the 21st century, and we have 20th and 21st century, I should say, and we have a similar situation, right? So last century, we had two world wars. So that's something never happened before, right? All of a sudden you have conflicts that are at a global level. This was a first in history. You have genocide on a massive scale during the 20th century, not just the Holocaust, but also a number of other instances of genocide throughout the 20th century. That also is something that was rather new. And highly disturbing. You have a lot of political change, a lot of political turmoil. The collapse of the Soviet Union, for instance, in the 1980s and early 90s, that sort of stuff. Then you move into the 21st century, and we have pandemics. We just got out of the COVID situation a few years ago. We have an increasing awareness of climate change, which may pose a significant, maybe not existential threat to humanity, but certainly a significant threat. And we thought until recently that this was going to happen in the future. It wasn't going to be affecting us, but now it is. Now it's increasingly clear that it's this generation that has to deal with the beginning of the effects of climate change. So you might imagine that all of these wars, genocide, pandemics, climate change, they generate anxiety. They generate political change, social change, anxiety. So once again, and in fact, we also live in a moment in which, at least in the West, the religion is in decline. Right. In most European countries, the number of religious people has dropped dramatically over the last few decades. Even in the United States, which is by far the most religious of the Western countries, mainstream religions have decreased significantly over the last two or three decades. So here we go again. The answers come from either religion or philosophy. So it's philosophy that is coming back, not just Stoicism. Stoicism certainly is the big story. Stoicism is arguably one of the dominant current new philosophies of life, but there is a resurgent interest in Buddhism, for instance, in modern versions of Buddhism. There is a resurgent interest in Neo-Confucianism. So the same three players that we just seen acting 2.5 millennia ago are back again, and also there are new philosophies. There is existentialism, which originated in France during the 20th century. There is a secular humanism which originated in the United States throughout, in the middle part of the 20th century, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's the answer. Major political and social turmoil. People seek answers because they don't know how to deal with it. Either religion or philosophy provide those answers.
Right. I'm going to have a 5 second to process all that information.
Process that, yes.
Yeah, because I never really have that kind of approach towards all of these phenomenon. at first I thought that Stoicism was just, at least how the popular one portrayed nowadays, is it feels like a grift to me, because there is
Mhm.
even a new name for it, a Broicism. I think you quite know that, where
Yep,
the
I
point
use
is
the
no
term,
longer.
yes.
Yeah. Oh wait, maybe you're the one who came up with the term, if I'm not
I
mistaken.
don't know that I came up with the term, but I definitely use it on a regular
Oh,
basis. Yes.
great. So before we go there, what's the difference between the first type of Stoicism and the modern Stoicism that we know today?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So Stoicism is a tradition that it's almost 2.5 millennia old, and so you you couldn't reasonably expect modern Stoicism to be exactly the same as ancient Stoicism, because in the meantime, we figure out a few things about the world, right? Both philosophy and especially science have made progress in the meantime. So if you want a modern version of Stoicism, it can't be exactly the same thing as it was 2.5 millennia ago. But this is not typical just of Stoicism, right? If you are a modern Buddhist, for instance, you very likely don't believe a lot of the things that ancient Buddhists believed. If you're, the saying goes, if you're a modern Confucian, and in fact, even if you embrace a religion, I grew up, for instance, in Rome, in Italy, initially as a Catholic. Even modern Christians are not the same as Christians from 2,000 years ago, right? Even when they refer to themselves as fundamentalist Christians, meaning that they really go to the letter of the Bible, that's just not the case. Nobody believes many of the things that people believed 2,000 years ago, and I would say, fortunately, because we've made some progress in the meantime, right? So the real question isn't necessarily, how does ancient Stoicism apply to modern society? The question is, how does a modern Stoic alters the original philosophy in a way that makes sense in the light of modern science? Uh, so there are a number of people, including myself, who have been working on this for the last several years. So there are a number of people who have authored books or articles about how to update Stoicism. And there are different ways of doing this. But by and large, the fundamental idea is that remember I mentioned before that there are three components to Stoic philosophy, right? Ethics, science, and logic.
Yeah.
Um, most modern Stoics think that Stoic ethics is pretty much still valid, meaning that there is not much that you need to tweak compared to the original, that the insights that the original Stoics had into human psychology and human nature are pretty much still valid. There are a few things that need to be updated with knowledge from cognitive science, for instance, or psychology, but not that much. Stoic logic is perfectly fine. It is not being improved upon over the last 2,000 years. It is true that modern logic, of course, has made progress. Modern logicians have uh, proposed systems of logic that are much more complicated, much more complex and sophisticated than uh, Stoic logic. But everyday people like you and I don't need modern sophisticated logics. Those are for special purposes. If you're doing, logic of quantum mechanics, let's say, or logic of computer processing or something like that, then you need the special logics. But for everyday living, for reasoning about issues that every normal person might encounter, Stoic logic is still perfectly fine. So those two, so ethics needs very little update. Logic basically no update. The big component that needs update is Stoic physics or Stoic science, right? Because in the meantime, science has in fact progressed. I already mentioned earlier one of the updates, and that is to get rid of the notion that the universe is a living organism endowed with reason, with logos. That one is untenable. You can't. I'm a scientist. It doesn't make any sense to me, from both the point of view of modern physics and modern biology, to think of the universe as a living organism. So you can get rid of it. Now, here's the problem, however. You mentioned a few minutes ago that Stoicism looks like a complex, unified system, not just a series of suggestions on how to live your life, but it's a comprehensive system. That's true. And one of the advantages of one of the nice features of Stoic philosophy is that it is a comprehensive system. The problem is that when you take out one part of the system, now you have to readjust the rest. You can't just take it out and throw it away. You have to replace it with something else that works, right? So if you take out, for instance, the notion of a living or a living cosmos, a living universe, right? One might think, okay, well, so what? You throw that one out, you replace it with the modern scientific conception of a universe that works by natural law, and you're done. And the problem is, no, you're not done, because the ancient conception of a living cosmos had consequences for Stoic ethics. One of the major consequences was the Stoic notion of providence. So let me explain it by using an example from the ancient Stoics. There is a passage in Epictetus' Enchiridion, in the Manual for a Good Life, which is a collection of the sayings of the ancient Stoic Epictetus, who lived in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. That passage is striking. When people read it the first time, they are taken aback and they're kind of shocked. The passage, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't remember the exact words. Also, the exact words depend on the translation anyway, because the original was in Greek. But more or less, the passage says, look, when you go to bed at night, kiss your wife, remember to kiss your wife and your child, because they're humans, they're human beings, they may die. And if you do this, you will not be disturbed. So you read that passage and you say, whoa, hold on a second. Are you telling me that I need to be prepared to the possibility that my wife or my child are going to die and I don't need to be disturbed? What kind of psychopath is this guy? I mean, yes, I understand that human beings are mortal. We all die. Yes, I understand I need to be prepared, but not to be disturbed? That seems callous. That seems like completely uncalled for. But Epictetus was not a psychopath. He was thinking from the point of view of somebody who believes that the universe is regulated by an intelligent organism, and therefore that everything that happens to the universe is for the best. That's the concept of Stoic providence. Now, it's not for the best in the Christian sense. Christians also have a concept of providence. But according to the Christians, God loves us individually, right? One by one. God's loves me, loves you, etc. That's not the case for the Stoics. For the Stoics, we are like cells of the cosmic organism, right? Now, if you think of it that way, I don't love my cells. They're just me. They're just part of me, but it's not like I love them. If a cell has to die, let's say my skin cells at some point have to die, because if they don't die, they become cancer and they're going to kill me, right? So that's the Stoic conception of providence. Everything happens for the best, but for the best of the cosmic organism, not for my own personal best. And so what Epictetus is saying there is like, look, you may not understand things because you're looking at it from the point of view of a cell. And you might be upset if your fellow cells are going to die. But in fact, this is really for a good purpose at a cosmic level. So you should not only accept it, but actually feel good about it. Okay. And if you believe that the universe is providential in that manner that I just described, this is a beautiful view. It really is comforting. It's just telling you that, wow, okay, even when tragedy strikes, I need to be good about it because it's actually for a purpose, right? If you start as a modern Stoic, if you throw away the notion that the universe is a intelligent living being, then you don't have providence anymore. Now, when your relatives, when your loved ones are going to die, that's just shitty. This is not a good thing, right? You can't comfort yourself by saying, "Oh well, everything is happening from the best," right? So, what is the alternative? Well, the only alternative is for a modern Stoic to accept as much as it is possible something that is inevitable because it is inevitable, right? If things are inevitable, if you cannot do anything about it, then you can only have two reactions. You either throw a tantrum like a child, right? You refuse to accept the universe because you don't like it. That's a childish behavior. Or you say, okay, this sucks, but this is the way it works. I understand that this is the way things are, and therefore I'm going to accept it, to endure, to do the best that I can, right? So that's just one example of the difference between modern Stoicism and ancient Stoicism. The modern Stoicism, unfortunately, is less comforting because it cannot rely on a concept of providence. But that's the way it is. And as a Stoic who is trying to live life rationally according to reason, I have to accept it. If science tells me that that's the way things work, I'll accept it provisionally until, of course, science may discover something else in the future, in which case we'll talk again.
Okay. So there is a saying, a comment, actually a comment from one of your videos. I forgot which videos it is. I think it's very, very interesting. The commenter said that the fact that two of the most popular Stoics are an emperor and the other is a slave is a testament of uh, how, how all-encompassing Stoicism is. Yeah, I
Yes.
think it. Yeah, what is your response to that?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I tend to think of Stoicism as a very large tent, a very large umbrella. Uh, it really doesn't matter whether you are at the top of society, like the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, or at the bottom, like the slave Epictetus. It doesn't matter what, even when you are, even for the ancient Stoics, it didn't matter whether you are a man or a woman. For instance, you know, in antiquity, unfortunately, people were far more sexist than we would like them to be, right? I mean, women often, both, especially in ancient Greece, but even so, even a little bit in ancient Rome, were, you know, certainly second class citizens. The Stoics were among the few schools of philosophy who explicitly said, no, there is no difference. It doesn't matter. So long as you're a rational being, so long as you're capable of reason, and women are capable of reason, then it's you know, you can practice philosophy just in the same way as anybody else. So Stoicism is a cosmopolitan philosophy. It did not recognize national boundaries. It did not recognize differences of, uh, you know, ethnicity, race, or anything like that. So one of the things that I find very exciting and interesting and useful about Stoicism in the 21st century is precisely that by its nature, it is open to everyone, regardless of social or economic class, regardless of gender, regardless of nationality, race, or anything else. And that to me is a powerful. In fact, the Stoics and their close cousins, the Cynics, which was another school at the time during the Hellenistic period, they are the very ones that invented the word cosmopolitan. The cosmopolitan means a citizen of the world, right? Cosmos is the world, and polis is city, right? So city of the world. And we're still struggling to really become cosmopolitan, but I think we made some progress. I mean, we have in the 21st century, we have organizations like the United Nations, which, although they are certainly imperfect and could certainly use quite a bit of improvement, they embody the cosmopolitan ethos. Just yesterday, you know, before this interview, yesterday was the anniversary of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was published in 1947, and it's a declaration that was signed by almost every country in the world, not everyone, but almost every country in the world, and the declaration basically says that we should treat everyone on Earth, regardless of where they come from or what they look like, as human beings, and therefore inherently as you know, according dignity. That is a Stoic concept. So the very fact that in the 21st century, one of the most advanced pieces of ethics, which is the notion of universal human rights, is is rooted on the notion of cosmopolitanism, which is a Stoic notion. That tells me that the Stoics got something right.
Okay. Um, why aren't we choose hedonism instead?
Sorry, why? What about
Oh,
hedonism?
In the 21st century, I mean, we are most of us really anxious and then
Oh
sounds
yeah.
hopeless. Why don't we choose hedonism? Why is Stoicism the one who rose to prominency?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you would think that hedonism would be the default position, right? Human beings are natural hedonists in a sense, meaning that most of us go around life trying to have as much pleasure as possible and as little pain as possible, which basically is the Epicurean position. Okay, according to the Epicureans, who were rivals to the Stoics, that's what you should do. You should try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And that's what a good life consists of. The Stoics disagreed, and they didn't disagree because they thought that pain is good or pleasure is bad. In fact, Seneca, one of the ancient Stoics who lived at the same time as Epictetus, he was a little older than Epictetus, in the first century. He actually writes a letter at some point to a friend of his, and he says, "Look, I'm not stupid. Of course, I prefer pleasure to pain." It's like, yes, but that's not the end of life. He says, right? So pleasure is good and pain is bad. And sure, of course, I'm going to do what I can to enjoy pleasure and to stay away from pain. But that's not the end of it all. It's not enough to provide with a good human life. If human beings simply stay at the level of pleasure and pain, we're no better than animals. That's what other animals do. Your cat or your dog, if you observe them for a couple of minutes, you'll see that they look for pleasure and stay away from pain. That's pretty much, and that's the end of their world. There's nothing else. It's not like they have any goals, they have any meaning, they're striving for something. That's all. That's the end of the story. Now, one might say, yeah, but human beings are animals, so why not, right?
Mm.
The Stoics suggested that yes, we're animals, but because we're conscious of what we do and why we do it and all that sort of stuff, we need something else. We don't need just pleasure and stay away from pain. We need goals. We need meaningful things to do. It turns out they were right. There is modern research in so-called positive psychology, which is the branch of psychology that has to do with how to improve human life, how to make people happier or at least less miserable, right? And modern positive psychologists suggest that a good life, there's a paper that came out just very recently about this. A good human life is made of two, maybe three components. The three components are what psychologists themselves called eudaimonic, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, hedonic, and then what they call psychological variety. So let me explain. So according to modern research, human beings need eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is actually the ancient Greek word that was used by the Stoics to indicate a life of meaning. Okay, so we need to do meaningful things. We need to engage in meaningful projects. Usually, not always, but usually these meaningful projects involve other people. That is, we find things meaningful if they are helpful to other people, if they involve us with other people. So obvious examples are things like certain professions are inherently eudaimonic, like doctors, for instance, right? You clearly help people, but less intuitively, writers, right? You don't write for yourself; you write for other people. Musicians, artists, they don't do it just for themselves; they do it for other people. Nurses, lawyers, if they actually try to help people as opposed to screwing them, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things that we do in our lives that acquire meaning because they involve positive relationships with other people. According to modern psychology, a fundamental aspect of human life is the eudaimonic one, has to be there. Then there are two more. One is the hedonic component, pleasure.
Yeah.
Right? We modern psychologists agree that pleasure does improve human life and pain does get in the way of a good quality of life. No question about it. But as I said, the Stoics themselves agreed with this one, right? Seneca did say that, yeah, of course you want pleasure and you don't want pain. And then the third component is what modern psychologists refer to as psychological variety. This is the notion that people seek different experiences. You get bored if you do the same thing over and over and over and over, right? So you seek different experiences. Different experiences might be things like, you change jobs, or you take up a hobby, or you travel, right? Or you read widely, or you go to concerts, or anything counts. Not anything, but a lot of things count as increasing the variety of psychological experiences in life. So, according to modern science, these are the three components of a good life. But importantly, the big one, the major component, is the eudaimonic one. That is, you can still have a good life if you have reduced psychological experiences. If you don't travel a lot, because you can't, let's say, you still have a good life. Even if you are in pain and you don't experience a lot of pleasure, life sucks if that's your situation. But so long as you're doing meaningful things, you're still okay. The one thing you cannot do without is meaning. When people lack meaning in their lives, they become depressed, anxious, suicidal, and so on and so forth, right? So lack of the other two doesn't lead to depression, but lack of meaning does. So I would say the ancient Stoics got it right. And the reason the Epicureans or the hedonists have it wrong is because they only latch onto one aspect of human life, and they make the mistake of thinking that that is the whole thing. It is certainly true that we need pleasure if possible, and we want to avoid pain. But that's not the beginning and the end of human life. It's not enough for a human being. It's enough for your cat, but not enough for you.
All right. Yeah, just give another 3 to 5 seconds to process those answers.
Sure.
Because um, yeah, I want to give. I actually want to give my audience a little bit of time to process it, because for me, I have a hard time understanding Stoicism.
Hmm.
Although I myself, I think of myself quite a Stoic type, but not necessarily, because I'm quite a non-reactionary type of guy. But I think it's more due to my financial circumstances rather than my pure observation towards life. That's why I kind of by default. I'm not glorifying myself here. I just try to process how did Stoics think. And yeah, your answer kind of make me understand more about Stoicism nowadays, at least within the context that how we should understand it from both sides. The new one and the old one, and now you kind of connect it to me, because I never see a connection between the two. Yeah, mainly because I um, expose a lot with the Broicist type, so I
Yeah.
maybe that's
Yes.
kind of affect how I see modern Stoicism. But now I
Yeah.
see the
We should
connection. Yeah.
maybe, if you don't mind, maybe we should talk just a minute about the Broics and these
Yeah.
modern what I think are modern are distortions of Stoicism. Um, the first thing I want to say is, again, Stoicism is not an exception. There are distortions of all sorts of other philosophies and religions. For instance, here in the United States, there is a distortion of Christianity, which is called the yeah,
Christian nationalism.
which well, it's not just evangelism. Evangelism is, to some extent, has always been a part of
Uh,
Christianity. No, it's the
Christian
prosperity,
nationalism, wasn't it?
what they
Oh,
call
prosperity.
the prosperity gospels, right?
Mm.
So this notion that what Jesus wants is to for you to make as much money as possible. In fact, if you're making a lot of money and you're very wealthy, that's a sign of the fact that Jesus likes you. That sort of stuff. That's complete nonsense from a point of view of Christianity. I mean, as I said, I am not a Christian now, but I grew up studying Christianity. I actually read the Old Testament and the New Testament, and there's nothing like that at all
Mm.
in Christianity. This is clearly a distortion of Christianity, which fits with the American ego of making money and living in a uber capitalistic society. So just like in the way in which Christianity, the prosperity gospels are a distortion of Christianity, Broicism and similar things are a distortion of Stoicism. So there are three major distortions of Stoicism, which I think are related to each other. One is what we have been referring to as Broicism, as in bros, right?
Mhm.
So these are people who think, these are typically young men or less young men who think that Stoicism, it's all about being a manly man, and whatever that means. And they say stupid things like, oh, the word virtue in Latin is ver, which is the root of it means man. So there you go. You need to be a manly man. These people are so ignorant that the thing is completely laughable, because yes, it's true, the word virtue does come from the Latin ver, which means man, but ver itself is a translation of the Greek arete, which means excellence, which is gender neutral. So these people are just idiots. They literally don't know what they're talking about. They simply are trying to use Stoicism as a way to justify their own misogyny and general approach to life. So that's one group. The second one is, I refer to it as Stoicism with a dollar sign, sometimes referred to as Silicon Valley Stoicism. So this is the notion that if you use Stoic techniques, you become successful, you win the Super Bowl, you become rich, you're great, you become a great entrepreneur and stuff like that. Now, the Stoics thought that there is nothing wrong with achievement. That is, if you do achieve success, fame, money, wealth, and so on and so forth, there's nothing wrong with it. These are all things that, according to the Stoics, do have value, but that's not the goal of a Stoic philosophy. The goal, as I said right at the beginning of this conversation, the goal of a Stoic philosophy is to make you a better human being. And Epictetus, in fact, explicitly says in the Discourses, here's a actually, I think it's in the Enchiridion, in the manual. Here's a non sequitur. I am richer than you, therefore I'm better than you. A non sequitur, of course, is a logical fallacy, right? Something that doesn't follow. So he says it right there explicitly. He says the fact that you are wealthy means nothing in terms of your value as a human being. You can be a wealthy man and an asshole and a really bad human being, or you can be a wealthy man and a really great human being. Similarly, if you are poor, just because you're poor, that doesn't make you a good human being, a good person. You may be a really bad person and happen to be poor, or you can be a good person. The point is, wealth, fame, success have nothing at all to do with being good. And being good is the goal of Stoicism, not being wealthy, famous, etc., etc. So that's true. That's the second one. The third one is, I usually spell it as Stoicism with a little s, but with a capital M at the end. The M at the end stands for militarism. So there is a lot of cult of Stoicism in the military, especially in the US military. There's a lot of people who write about the fact, the warrior ethos, these kind of things. And again, they make the same mistake. They pick on one instance, on one aspect of ancient Stoicism. It is true that a lot of ancient Stoics were in the military, for sure. Socrates, who was not a Stoic but was the inspiration for the Stoics, he was a soldier in the Athenian army. He as far as we know, he fought in at least 3 major battles during the Peloponnesian War. Sure, everybody was a soldier, so that doesn't matter. That's not really doesn't prove anything. And the issue is, can Stoicism be useful to soldiers, to people in the military? Yes, but not as a survival strategy, which is the way it's usually presented, but as an ethical compass, right? If you're a soldier, you want to do the right thing. You want to act ethically. You want to be a moral soldier, not just somebody who goes around shooting people no matter what, right? That means that if you're a Stoic soldier, you ought to be prepared, for instance, to disobey immoral orders. If your commander tells you shoot civilians, you should not do it, even though there is a danger you're going to be court-martialed, or a danger that you're going to be shot if it's in a war situation. It doesn't matter. According to the Stoics, you ought to first and foremost act reasonably and pro-socially toward other people. Shooting civilian is neither reasonable nor pro-social. So if the military, especially the US military, really were to actually incorporate Stoicism in its ethos, you would see a lot less action, a lot less military action around the world, because frankly, most military actions in the world, no matter who does them, are in fact immoral. There is a theory about this, right? There is philosophers ever since the ancient Greco-Romans have developed what we call today just war theory. So there are situations. The Stoics were not pacifists, right? It's not like they said you never need to go to war. If people invade you, if somebody attacks you, you have the right, and in fact you have a duty to self-defense. So it's not that they argued against war, but they said the bar for entering into war should be really high. And they actually spell out, not just the Stoics, but there is a whole tradition, as I said, of just war theory. They spell out what these conditions should be, right? Only in self-defense, never invading somebody else. Proportional response. In other words, you don't do shock and awe, as the term is today. You just respond proportionally. You stop using violence as soon as it's feasible, and you revert to diplomatic means. You don't target civilians, and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of criteria. By those criteria, very few, if any, wars in history have actually been just wars. But my point is, there's nothing inherently unstoic about being in the military. But there is definitely something, a lot, that is unstoic about being in the military as it's typically conceived and that is typically operating these days.
All right. So
we might need to shift to the second half because we are almost in an hour, right?
yeah, I just realized 20 minutes ago that we actually already passed the 40 minutes, 30
It
minutes bar.
happens.
Yeah, I get quite, I really enjoy this conversation because,
Yes.
yeah, Stoicism is the first philosophy book that I ever read. I read Seneca's Letter to a Stoic book, and I
Yes.
didn't finish it because I find it very confusing. And then now here I am, going full circle back into Stoicism after going way too far in the philosophy of religion scenes. But I think we have to give the next questions to Steve.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm quite interested also about your thesis, Steve, because, you know, turns out that Professor Pigliucci is more than just a Stoic, but also a philosopher of science, which is cool. So yeah, of course.
Yeah.
You have 30 to
That's
40
actually my
minutes.
job, my day job. Yes.
So I see. Okay, all right. So Steve, prepare yourself, and the mic is yours to ask, Steve.
Okay.
Silakan.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss your extensive work on philosophy of science and philosophy of pseudoscience. Uh, it is really such an honor for me to be able to interview and talk to you face to face like this. Before I go to the first question, I want to ask something a little bit peculiar. In philosophy of science, there is something called context of justification and context of discovery from Hans Reichenbach. So, Professor Massimo, when did you found yourself that you are gonna do some research in conceptual manner about philosophy of science? What are your contexts of discovery like? And the follow up question is, the $1 billion question is, what is the demarcation problem?
Okay, let's see if we can tackle these things one at a time. So first of all, how did I get into philosophy of science in the first place? My original academic training, is in science, in biology, specifically in evolutionary biology. So for 20 plus years, I was active as an evolutionary biologist. I was publishing in that area. I was doing research in that area. However, little by little, I also discovered that I was more interested in what you might consider conceptual questions rather than empirical studies. So I was, my lab was carrying out a lot of empirical research, both in the field and in the laboratory. But the things that really excited me the most were the big questions, in a sense, right? So what is the structure of evolutionary theory, for instance? How did that structure evolve over time? Since Darwin, we've seen a number of iterations of evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory is, in a sense, evolving. And so I was interested in that kind of, what novel discoveries, what new conceptual advances have taken place throughout the 20th century, for instance, that might require a new version of evolutionary theory to be articulated. And when I started pursuing those questions, I quickly realized that that's exactly what philosophers of science ask. Right? So these are questions that typically biologists don't ask themselves, because biologists tend to be busy doing the actual research in the field, or in the laboratory. Often the kind of people that ask those kinds of broad, big questions are the philosophers of science. So eventually I realized that if I wanted to pursue those questions, I had to move to philosophy of science. And what I did was I took a sabbatical year, so a year without teaching. I went back to graduate school. I got my PhD in philosophy. It took a little bit more than a year, of course, but and then eventually I shifted field and I moved full time to philosophy of science. Now, once I got to philosophy of science, it turns out that I also, in the meantime, for many, many years, had an interest in pseudoscience ever since I was in high school. Really,
What is
I was fascinated by why is it that people believe in astrology, parapsychology, UFOs, ghosts, and so and so on and so forth. It's like, wow, this is
supernatural things?
bizarre. Yeah, I thought this is strange. We live in the 20th century at the time, now the 21st century. It's the century of science. We've been on the moon. We have particle accelerators. We have telescopes that orbit around Earth. And then there are still people that believe in ghosts and astrology. It's like, how is that even possible, right?
It's
So I
funny.
was always curious. Yeah, it's a funny thing, funny business. So I was always curious. And it turns out when I moved to philosophy of science, I discovered that a subgroup of philosophers of science are interested in this very question, which, as you know, is referred to as the demarcation issue in philosophy of science. Now, before we go there, however, let me briefly address the issue of the difference between the context of discovery and the context of justification, right? So that's a phrase that came out of one of the major philosophers of science of the 20th century, Karl Popper, who was interested not only in the nature of science, the very first thing that I mentioned a minute ago, but also in the demarcation problem. In fact, he's the one that invented the demarcation problem, the phrase the demarcation problem, in a sense, near the beginning of the 20th century. So Popper thought that there are two somewhat distinct modalities within science, what he called the context of discovery and the context of justification. And he said, the context of discovery is whatever makes it possible for scientists to discover new things, have new ideas. And he said that thing, those those new ideas come out of all sorts of unpredictable circumstances. A scientist might go and take a shower and have a brilliant idea, or
Or
sleep and
like
wake up, have a dream and wake up and has a brilliant idea, or go for a walk and have a brilliant idea. So we don't know how the human brain produces those ideas. They are, of course, the result of subconscious processing of a lot of information. It's not like you just take a shower and you have a brilliant idea. You have to have thought about whatever the problem was for a long time, and then what the shower does, or what the walk does, or what the dreaming, sleeping does, is it allows your brain to process that information without interference from conscious thinking. And all of a sudden something pops out to your mind. And you say, whoa, this is an interesting idea. Let me pursue it. So according to Popper, that is the context of discovery. That is, we don't really, discovery, new ideas come out of a complex subconscious way of thinking of working of the human
random
brain.
things. Yeah.
They're not quite random because, as I said, you have to actually have studied quite a bit. It's not like
Yeah.
you can, not everybody goes to sleep and then wakes up with a brilliant idea.
Like
But certainly it's not under our control.
Kekule is sleep and dreaming like there is a snake who ate his tail.
Yes.
I think it's
Yes.
a very unique, random things. I think.
Right, exactly. But you also have, plenty of that particular example, for instance, the Kekule example. Yes, that's how he came up with the idea that some molecules have, a circular structure. Essentially, they look like the snake that bites its own tail. But you and I might have had the same dream and never would have thought that
Oh
that
yeah,
had anything to do with chemistry, right?
of
It's only
course.
because Kekule was a chemist that
Yeah.
this kind of thing came up to his mind. That's what I mean when I say it's not entirely random, but it certainly is subconscious and it's unpredictable. Then Popper said, yes, but that's only the beginning. You have to have the good idea, but then you have to test the idea, right? Then you have to check whether the idea actually works, because an idea might seem brilliant,
Yeah.
but if it doesn't work, then it's not brilliant. It's just yet another, dead end. That is the context of verification. He says, okay, now the hard work starts. You have to take your time, think about carefully. Okay, this is an interesting idea. How do I test it? What kind of empirical evidence, what kind of observations, what kind of experiments might be able to test that idea? And his notion was that that's where philosophy of science comes in. That is, the philosophers of science are interested mostly in the context of verification, because the context of verification works at a conscious level on the basis of logical rules, while the context of discovery works at a subconscious level and doesn't seem to follow any particular rule. Right? So think about it as if you were a detective, right? Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes has ideas, has these intuitions, right? And sometimes they're brilliant, but he always checks them. It doesn't just say, "Oh, I know who the culprit is," right? That guy did it. Well, no, you have to prove it. You have to have data to actually prove that that is the situation. So that was the difference that Popper was pointing out between discovery and justification. So finally, let me go back to your $1 million question, which is the demarcation problem, right? So how do we tell the difference between science and pseudoscience? People have tried for a long time. In fact, I said earlier, a minute ago, that Popper is the one that invented the problem in the early part of the 20th century, meaning that he recognized that there was a problem. He actually came up with a terminology and he tried to solve it. But in fact, this is a really old problem. There is a Platonic dialogue written 2,400 years ago called the Charmides. In the Charmides, Socrates at one point raises the question, how do we tell the difference between a true doctor and a quack? That is the first time in Western history where somebody has raised the demarcation problem. Now, Socrates' answer was, you have to be an expert yourself. You have to, only doctors can. Yeah, you have to be a doctor. Only doctors can tell the difference between a doctor and a quack, right? Which is certainly one way to answer it. It's not the only way, as it turned out, to answer it, but it's definitely one way. So my point is, this is a really, really old question. Now, in modern philosophy of science, the demarcation problem was abandoned at some point in the 1980s because this guy, a colleague of mine at the University of Pittsburgh, Larry Loudon, wrote a very influential article back, I think it was in 1983, where he said, look, people, we tried to solve this problem for a long time. It's hopeless. There's no solution, so just give it up. Do something else. Busy yourself with analyzing actual specific claims, but forget about a general demarcation between science and pseudoscience, because it's just not going to work. That article was so influential that, like, for 20 years, almost no philosopher of science wrote anything about the demarcation problem. It was like if you look at the literature, there was like a black hole. There's nothing there. Almost nothing. I mean, there were a few people who did, but very few.
But in 2013, there is a philosopher who are very, very, it's very big and
yes. So the book that you just showed, The Philosophy of Pseudoscience, published by University of Chicago Press, this was put together by myself and a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Martin Baudry. And we were trying to resurrect the field. We basically looked at Loudon article and we said, wait a minute, yes, that's the book. This is way too early. This is no way to do things. Just because a problem is difficult, that doesn't mean that there is no solution, or at least it doesn't mean that we cannot make progress. So we asked a bunch of colleagues to come together physically for a conference, and then to So to discuss these kind of problems, I organized a conference here in New York at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And then we put together all these essays, trying to convince our colleagues basically that the demarcation problem not only is an interesting problem from a philosophical perspective, but it's a really practical one because it's important. Pseudoscience is not just about people reading the horoscope in the morning and then going on to continue their lives as if nothing happened. That's fine. That's not a big problem. The big problem is when people stop vaccinating their kids because
Yes.
they believe pseudoscientific claims. The big problem is when people oppose policies that are meant to curb climate change because
When
they don't
government
believe that there is climate change, right?
when government doesn't believe scientists anymore, the death of expertise and
Right.
some.
Right. As in the United States right now. I mean, I can't believe that we are now governed by an entire cabinet of pseudoscientists, right? All the way from the president of the United States to the secretary of health services. They are into pseudoscience. They are pushing things that are absolute nonsense, and they're literally killing people. Right? We've had in the United States, we've had outbreaks of diseases that were had all but disappeared, like smallpox. It's incredible to me that in the 21st century, the United States of America has to have outbreaks of smallpox because these idiots that are in charge are pushing pseudoscience. So to me, this was important, not just as an intellectual problem, but as a practical problem. People literally are killed by pseudoscience, right? So we put together this book, and to our own surprise, because academics do these kind of things all the time. We get together for a conference in a nice location like New York. We have a good time. We publish a book, and then we're done. It's like, okay, who knows? It's probably going to be ignored because most books are ignored anyway. This one went differently, as it turns out. So the entire field, I don't want to sound immodest here, but I
Okay.
really believe that the entire field of demarcation has been resurgent over the last 20 years because of that book. That book has made it, or 10, 15 years, because that book has finally reawakened people and said, whoa, there is something important here, and there is something consequential, there is something interesting. And so sure enough, if you look at the number of papers published on not only the demarcation problem specifically, but in general about what is now called the philosophy of pseudoscience, as a reflection of that book, that number of papers has skyrocketed. There is a large number of colleagues, especially young colleagues from all over the world, who have started publishing in that area, and I think that's a good thing. That's a great result.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Uh, I really it's such an honor to talk to you because I'm such a big fan of you.
Thank you.
Let's move on to the next question. In so, is there a set of criteria that infallibly identify something as scientific, considering there is the nation of the disunity of science from John Dupre, critics to reductionism and essentialism? Is there any single set of criterion uh, for the
Yeah.
demarcation problem?
No, there isn't. I mean, on that one, Larry Laudan, the guy who wrote the paper in 1983, was right. So when he said at some point, one of his arguments was, look, people have looked for a straightforward definition of science or pseudoscience, and specifically for a definition that is based on a small number of necessary and sufficient criteria.
Yes.
That's philosophical jargon. I'm going to explain that in a second. And they failed, right? And Laudan is right. There is no set of necessary and sufficient criteria, as far as we can tell, that will infallibly, as you say, separate science from pseudoscience. This is just not going to happen. We at this point we have pretty good reason to think that that's not the thing. What I disagree with Laudan is that that's the end of the matter. That's okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's done. Then we're done.
So
So first of all, let me.
It's so fallibilistic thinking, and
Right. There is a fallibilist component answer to that kind of challenge. But let's get there in a second. So first of all, what is a set of necessary and sufficient criteria? This is the kind of criteria that people use in logic and mathematics when they want to give definitions, right? For instance, in geometry, let's say, in Euclidean geometry, the definition of a triangle is a geometrical figure that has three sides, and the sum of the internal angles is 180 degrees. Okay, those two conditions, three sides and a total of 180 degrees of the internal angles, are necessary and sufficient for something to be a triangle. Meaning, they're necessary. If a geometrical figure does not have those two characteristics, it's not a triangle.
Yes.
It may be a square, maybe a circle, maybe something else, but it's not a triangle. It's also sufficient because if a geometrical figure does have those two characteristics, that's enough. You don't need to know anything else.
Yes.
It's a triangle. Okay, great. Now, the problem with that kind of definition is that it only works within mathematics and logic, and occasionally in the real world. For instance, occasionally. For instance, if you look at the periodic table in chemistry, right, and you say, oh, helium has a atomic number of 1, right, meaning that it has 1 electron, 1 proton, etc., right? Well, that's necessary and sufficient. For an element to be helium, it has to have there are actually some exceptions known as isotopes, but we'll forget about those for a minute, right? So generally speaking, it is true that an element is identified on the periodic table by its atomic number. That's it. All you need to know is the atomic number, and you know immediately if you're talking about helium or oxygen or gold or anything else. Okay, as I said, with the exception of well understood exception, however, of isotopes. So there are very few examples in the real world of things that are so simple. The elements are simple. They are literally among the simplest things in the world, right, in the universe. There are very few examples where necessary and sufficient conditions are actually applied. We have known since the middle of the 20th century, at least, because of another philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was not a philosopher of science, but he was a philosopher of language. But he was interested in definitions. And he said, look, most actual concepts, most interesting concepts have fuzzy boundaries. They're not sharp. Things like love. Do you want to give me a definition of love? Well, good luck, right? It's not going to be the kind of necessary and sufficient condition. But that doesn't mean we don't know what love is.
Yes.
Right? We can say certain things about love that are true, and then we can also say other things about love that are not true, which means that we have an idea of what love is. The same goes for concepts like science and pseudoscience. It's true that we cannot give a definition based on a small set of necessary and sufficient conditions. But that doesn't mean we don't have no idea what science is or pseudoscience is, right? So for instance, science is, first of all, an empirical discipline. It's an empirical approach to understanding the world. Right? If you don't do any empirical research at all, you're not doing science.
Yes.
It's true that there is theoretical science, but theoretical science doesn't really become science unless there are observations or experiments that confirm or disconfirm the theory. Okay? If you just do theories about how the world works without any empirical evidence, you're not doing science, you're doing metaphysics.
Yes.
So there has to be an empirical component. That empirical component, however, by itself is not enough. Science is not a collection of observations about the world, right? It's not stamp collecting or it's not butterfly collecting. Those observations about the world has to be systematized by a theory. There has to be a theoretical component. So in other words, theory and empirical evidence have to both be present, and they have to work in a particular way in order for you to do science. Because you could say, well, if I live in New York City, if I navigate the subway system in New York, let's say, I do it on the basis of a theory. I have a map of the subway system. That's a theory. And on the basis of empirical evidence, right? I actually can check whether the Clark Street in Brooklyn has a subway stop or not. Yes, it does, as it turns out, right? You could say, well, you're doing science then. No, because that isn't the kind of relationship between theories and empirical evidence. It's not the kind of theory we're talking about. So there are certain characteristics that we know make up science. One of them you just mentioned a few minutes ago, it's fallibilism. There is the notion that scientific theories are fallible. We don't know whether scientific theory is true or not. We only know that a particular theory at a particular moment seem to explain the available data pretty well. That's it. But as a scientist, you never use the word true for
Yeah,
a theory, because you don't know whether a theory is true. You never know whether a theory is true. You only know that it's good enough to explain the evidence at the moment.
and it's
But
not
you also
falsified.
know that, sorry,
And it's not falsified yet.
right, it's not yet falsified, right? So the history of scientific theories tells us that scientific theories eventually get replaced. They get falsified and rejected and eventually replaced by something else. So there's fallibilism. There is another aspect of science that has to do with probabilism, meaning that you only make statements that are probable, not certain, right? The only certainty in the world comes from logic and mathematics, not about science. Science is open-ended, so it is nothing to do with certainty.
It comes up to my mind. There is an analogy from Peter Godfrey Smith that said that proper philosophy is a very like a holy grail. Like you can search, you cannot search for the holy one, but you can experience it when the grail is not holy. Like you can
That's right.
tell, you can tell the difference, but you will never know if the grail is holy. I think it's a
That's right.
very fallibilistic things to.
Exactly. So it's probabilistic, it's fallibilistic, and so on and so forth. Now, what does that tell us about pseudoscience? Well, pseudoscience, the best way to understand pseudoscience, this is not a formal definition because, as I said, just like there is no formal definition of science, I don't think there is a formal definition of pseudoscience either. But as the word itself says, pseudo in Greek means fake.
Fake.
Okay? So pseudoscience literally means fake science. So the pseudoscience is something that pretends to be scientific, but it's not, right? But fails scientific standards, right? So if you look at pseudosciences like homeopathy or astrology or ufology or parapsychology, all of these things, they pretend to be scientific, meaning that people that believe in these things organize conferences that look like scientific conferences. They publish papers that look like scientific papers. They use statistical analysis that look like the statistics that scientists use. But they're actually not producing scientific theories. They're simply reinforcing their own beliefs. That is, they already know where they want to go. They know the truth with a capital T. They know that UFOs are really flying saucers. They know that astrology really works. They know that homeopathy really works. They're not doing research. They're simply confirming what they think they already know. And that is what makes it pseudo.
But here's my question. Here is a follow up question. I think
Sure.
when you say it's look like science, how
Yeah.
we can even know that there is a look like. I mean, like as you said earlier, how to tell the doctor from the quackery one, the fake doctor was. You have to become doctor, right? Like if I didn't even know what's the paradigm and the auxiliary hypothesis within the homeopathy or in galvanism, try to resurrect a dead man from the dead, try to resurrect. I think I'm a very curious in how we can know that thing.
Yeah.
Look,
Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but Socrates was right.
no,
That
no.
is, you have to be an expert, right? So here's the thing. Let me put it this way. Outside of, let's forget science and pseudoscience for a minute, right? Let's say that you have a problem with your car, right? That your car is not working. It's got something wrong. And you're not a mechanic. You're not an expert, right? You don't know how to fix your car. where do you go?
Uh,
Presumably, you go to a mechanic, right?
yes, mechanical.
Right. So you don't go to a priest. You don't go to a doctor. You don't go to a lawyer, right? You go to a
Right.
mechanic.
Of
Why do
course.
you go to a mechanic? Because
Because
he's an expert.
I believe him.
Right. Now, if a friend of yours says, "Oh no, I'm a mechanic. I can fix the problem," right? I'm just going to do some magical rituals. I'm going to dance around the car, and the car is going to be fixed.
I don't believe you.
How do you know that he's a pseudo mechanic?
I don't
On
believe you.
what basis are you going to make that distinction?
Yeah. It's very unique because there is like a personal thing, subjective things that you kind of get sense to go to mechanic if your car get wrong, or you go to the doctor if your health
Right.
is not right. Like, yeah,
Right. It's
instinct.
trial. In other words, it's trial and errors, right? You go to a mechanic, and so long as he fixes your car. But if he doesn't fix your car, you stop going. Right? You go to another mechanic, you go to somebody else. The same goes, therefore, in other words, you trust your mechanic. Why do you trust him? Because he has solved the problem in the past, because he has a track record, right?
Yeah.
And so that is the way in which we, members of the general public, should approach the demarcation problem. You should look at the track record of alleged experts and say things like, okay, the question now is whether vaccines work or don't work. What's the track record? Well, it turns out the track record is pretty clear. Vaccines work, right?
Yeah.
They've worked for more than a century. They saved millions of lives and so on and so forth. So I'm going to trust my doctor, or I'm going to trust medical authorities that endorse vaccines provisionally, only until it doesn't work. If it turns out that there is going to be mounting evidence that in fact things don't work, then we'll change our mind. But the approach is exactly the same. Nobody can give me a very a foolproof way to know whether a mechanic, what the difference is between a mechanic and a pseudo mechanic, or a dentist and a pseudo dentist.
Yes.
The only thing I can do is to give it a try, and if it works, keep going to the same person. I can also check their credentials, right? I can go, if you go to a doctor, for instance, typically you see diplomas on their walls. Why? Because they want to show you that they actually are doctors. They're not, that they went to a reputable university, they've been properly trained, and so on and so forth. You can do the same with a mechanic. You can check, is this guy really a mechanic? Not only does he have the reputation, but is it licensed to be a mechanic, right?
Yes.
Does it have what it takes to be a mechanic? It's exactly the same approach.
Yes.
And what baffles me in all this is that the general public uses its brain when it comes to mechanics,
but
not
it's
when it comes to doctors or scientists, which is really bizarre. It's really strange.
Yes. It's very unique. Maybe one last question. I mean,
Sure.
like, maybe some people will say that your argument is appeal from authority, but who cares? I think appeal from authority. I think appeal from authority is if it's functional and if it's can fix my car. I think we will go to authority to
That's right.
fix our
Yes.
car.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because the appeal to authority, which is a typical objection, you're right, of pseudoscience, people who believe in pseudoscience, it's supposed to be an informal logical fallacy, right?
Yes, informal. Of
Now,
course.
logical fallacy come into two different kinds. There are formal logical
Yes.
fallacies. These are fallacies in the structure of reasoning. Okay, so these are when you are mounting a type of deductive reasoning that is in fact incorrect, like
Yes.
doing an incorrect mathematical proof. Okay,
Of course.
formal logical fallacies. There is no question that they're fallacies. If you
Yeah.
make a formal logical mistake, it's a mistake. End of story. The informal fallacies, however, are a little bit more complicated. A friend of mine, the same friend, Martin Baldry, with whom I wrote, I put together, co-edited the book on pseudoscience. We co-authored a paper a few years ago with a third friend, Fabio Paglieri, about logical fallacies, informal logical fallacies. And we said, You need to be careful because informal logical fallacies sometimes are not fallacious at all.
Yes.
For instance, another informal logical fallacy is the so-called ad hominem, right? When you
Ah,
attack somebody's
yes.
character rather than these arguments, right?
You're a liar.
Okay, yes, but if you say right, so but if you say, look, Massimo, I'm looking for a new car. I'm thinking of buying this car from this dealership. Do you think it's a good idea? And I tell you, careful, because the dealer there has a reputation for selling lemons, for selling bad cars, right?
Ad hominem.
Now, I'm attacking his character. Okay,
Yes.
this is not an argument against any specific car that he's selling. It's just a general comment about his character. But you'd be a fool not to pay attention to that kind of warning, right? Because that warning doesn't tell you that he always sells lemons, but it tells you be on guard because there is a good chance you're going to get a lemon. The same goes with authority, with appeal to authority. If your authority is a random guy on the internet, if you say, "Hey, my friend, I read on this blog that blah blah blah," it's like, okay, who the hell is this guy? Who wrote this thing? Why should I trust him? But if the authority is an actual expert who is credentialed in that field, who has a track record in that field, not only that's not a fallacy, that's actually the best thing you can do.
Yes.
Again, with the example that I just made of a dentist or a car mechanic, right? You want an expert. You don't want
Yes.
somebody who doesn't know anything, right? Now, it would be a fallacy if you were saying, I completely blindly trust anybody who claims to be an expert. That would be a bad idea. You don't blindly trust. You're not supposed to blindly trust anybody.
Yes.
You trust people only provisionally. That is, only so long as you have good reasons to trust them. You have to check their track record. You have
Indeed.
to check their credentials, right? Then you can trust them. And trust is not the same as faith. Right?
Yes.
Faith is you believe somebody regardless of the evidence. Trust is provisional, right? I trust all sorts of things only because I have reasons to trust. Like, for instance, my wife just went out, went to work. I trust that my wife loves me. Why? Well, in part because she says so, sure, but also because she acts that way, right? So she loves in that she acts in a loving way. If I were to come home all of a sudden and my wife were to whack me on the head with something every time that I came home, and then she always talk to me in an abusive fashion and never follow, never listen to me and all, I will start having doubts. It's like, wait a minute, this is not what love is supposed to be. And therefore I would revise my trust, right? I will withdraw my trust. In other words, trust is in fact proportional to the evidence.
Yes.
What kind of evidence? In this case, in the case that we're talking about of science and pseudoscience, it's proportional to the track record of the expert. It's proportional to the background of the expert. Who that person is. Does it have genuine claims at expertise? And we can check on these things. If you want to check on your doctor whether he's a real doctor, you can do that. Typically, you can just Google it. What you cannot do is to argue with the doctor about medicine unless you yourself are a doctor. I mean, when people say, "Oh, I'll do my," during the pandemic, people used to some people started saying things like, "Oh, I'll do my own research." You're not capable. Most of us are not
Yeah.
capable of doing their own research. Doing research doesn't mean Googling something and then read the first 10 pages that
Yes.
come out. That's not research, right? Doing research means you have to have the know-how, you have to have the expertise to really understand what you're reading and to really weigh the pros and cons of something. Most of us, by definition, are not experts on most things. Even if you are an expert, you tend to be an expert on one or two things. By the way, that's also incidentally means that you shouldn't trust an expert in an area where he is not an expert,
Capable. Yes.
right? So if somebody wins the Nobel Prize in physics, for instance, right, that's a pretty good indication that he's a good physicist. But if that person starts giving you financial advice on how to invest your money, run,
Run.
because he's not an economist, right? There's
Yes.
no reason to believe the financial advice of a Nobel physicist, because that is not the kind of expert that we're talking about.
Okay, Professor Massimo. Uh, there's as you said, there's a lot of expert also in the topic of pseudoscience. A lot of your friends also write in this book, Sven Ove Hansen, James Ladiman, and so on and so on.
Yes.
And I think is a very what is it positive like you are very like positive about the term. But still, there is like Michael Gordon, who is very skeptical historians of science, of course, and so on and so on. But I think this is maybe my last question. Let's move on from science and pseudoscience. But in the most general things, is there any limit for science itself? Like in your article, you draw a parallel between pseudoscience and scientism, which you characterize as the unwarranted subset of scientific forays into the humanities. How is
Right.
scientism, such as the attempt to argue that science alone can determine moral values, symmetrically problematic to pseudoscience? And what shared epistemic flow do both attitudes exhibit? Maybe it's just my
Right.
last question
Oh,
in the
I
topic of.
completely agree. Science has limits. There's no question about it. Science is a human invention. It's a human activity. And human brains are limited. It's about 3 pounds of meat over here, right? Now, it's amazing what we can do with our brains. I mean, we evolved, our intelligence evolved to solve survival problems, right? Not to discover quantum mechanics or general relativity. So it's amazing to me that we can use brains that definitely did not evolve to discover the ultimate truths about the universe, and yet we have in fact discovered quite a bit. But there are limits. I'm sure there are things that human beings will never be able to understand. Definitely there are limits to science, because science is a human activity and human beings are in fact limited. Also, there are some areas where science has little or not much to say, right? I mean, sure, science can give me some information about, let's say, aesthetics, right? Aesthetic preferences. Psychologists can study aesthetic preferences and can tell me, broad things about why people like certain paintings or certain kinds of music. But at the end of the day, I'm going to make my own decision without consulting the psychologist. If I like a particular type of music or a painting, then I'm going to listen to it, or I'm going to put it in my house. If not, not. It does. I don't really need the scientific, information about that sort of stuff. There are ethical decisions that don't depend on science, although I would argue that ethical decision making better be informed by the available science, because ethical decision making is about decisions in the real world. Therefore, it should be informed by science. There are entire disciplines that have nothing to do at all with science. Mathematics and logic. Mathematics and logic have no connection with the empirical world in terms of validation, internal validation. Yes, they are very useful to scientists, right? Both math and logic are very useful to scientists. But you don't prove a mathematical theorem or a logical theorem by experiment or by observation. You prove it by deductive logic, right? So that's an area where science just doesn't enter it at all. Science uses math and logic, but it has nothing to contribute to science and logic. So there are limits to science. That said, when people say, oh, we need to go beyond science, right? What is beyond? Where does this beyond come from?
The
Where do you, well, what do you think that, so if the question is, my bet is, if the question that we're asking concerns the nature of the world, anything about the nature of the world, let it, if it is about the nature of the cosmos at large, the nature of biological organism, the nature of physical objects and all that sort of stuff, science is the only bet. Anybody who says that there is something beyond science is bullshitting you, or it's bullshitting themselves. Science has such a track record over millennia. We have not invented anything better in order to understand the world. So if the question is, has to do with how the world, the actual physical world works, then science is really the only game in town. There's nothing else. I am open to the possibility that one day somebody will invent something better, but so far they have not. So anything like a mystical insight or intuition or whatever it is, none of that works. When it comes to understanding the world, science is the only game in town. But understanding the world is not the only thing we're interested in.
Yes.
We're also interested in producing art. We're interested in
Music.
producing music. We're interested in talking to each other, in producing literature. We're interested in exploring potential worlds by the way of logic and mathematics. And all of those things have very little, if anything, to do with science. And therefore, science has its place, but it's not all comprehensive.
Right, Professor Massimo. Like Sven Ove Hansen said that we have to draw science and pseudoscience problem to the general epistemology criterion. Like science is the best things that we had, and we have to make sure that we use it well. I think. Thank you so much for our discussion. Your warm and kindly uh, talk is very
Thank
nice.
you. Thank you. It was really a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Right, we are not finished yet actually. I
Ah,
have one more question for you, and we
sure.
have to close it the Indonesian way, right, Stephen? Like say thanks
Oh
and.
yeah, of course.
No, just one more question, Professor. We going back to the. But before that, I really appreciate your question, Steve, and yeah, it kind of gives me a newfound appreciation towards science and newfound appreciation towards philosophy in general. And yeah, I kind of loved the moments where we three of us kind of geeked out with the terms that professor gave us. You feel geeking out. Wow, he says this. He says this. I read this in this article, and he said it in this exact moment. He said this to us. It's a geek out experience, and yeah. Okay. Sorry. I kind of becoming a geek myself there. Okay, just last one question. So there is a creator, Indonesian creator that focuses on philosophy, on Stoicism. He lived in the United States, so he kind of experienced Stoicism the Western way, and he gave me this kind of question that he wished you to answer. So yeah, it's quite loaded. Maybe you can help me parse out
Okay.
the question here. He asked why every politician should read Seneca.
Ah,
It's loaded question, but yeah.
Um, I'm not sure that I agree with the premise. I don't think necessarily every politician should be reading Seneca. But I think that every politician would benefit from reading some of the ancient Stoics, or in fact, even in general, some of the ancient Greco-Romans or the Confucians or the Buddhists. In other words, politicians like everybody else, would benefit from a broader perspective about meaning and ethics and what is it that they're doing. Because politicians tend to, seems to me, they tend to forget why they're there in the first place. Especially in the United States, now politics has become mostly a game that requires a lot of money. If you don't raise a huge amount of money, you're not going to get elected. And as soon as you get elected, you have to start all over again, raising more money. Otherwise, you're not going to be reelected a few years later. So it has become a, and when there is that much money into, I mean, you can argue that money has always been into politics, but when we're talking about billionaires and large corporations who can literally buy themselves politicians, it seems like politicians might benefit from some philosophical reflection on why are they there in the first place, what are they supposed to be doing in the first place. So would I suggest Seneca? Sure. Seneca is a it certainly makes for interesting and pertinent reading. I think any of the well, not any, but many of the ancient traditions, the wisdom traditions, both in the East and the West, would benefit. I mean, I would much rather have a politician who is steeped in Confucianism or Buddhism or Stoicism than have somebody who doesn't know any of those things. One of the problems with the political class, especially in the United States at this point. I mean, I don't know, obviously, in Indonesia, but the United States, the political class in the United States is mostly ignorant. It's made of people who clearly don't read books. They clearly don't forget Seneca. They just don't read any book. Period.
Same here with
Same
me.
here.
Yeah, right.
Vice President.
I mean,
Vice
we have a
President.
we have a president whose attention span is a few microseconds. So he simply cannot read. Forget a book. Cannot even read a briefing by his own assistants. So that is a sad state of affairs, but it's also a very dangerous state of affairs. Right? The best examples, I think, of politicians we have throughout history, regardless of culture and regardless of time period, are people who were thoughtful and who thought very clearly and very deeply about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And you can't do that if you are ignorant. You can't do that if you're not well read. I'm sorry, education is fundamental. It's fundamental for the rest of us, obviously. It's fundamental for everybody, but it's fundamental especially for somebody who is in charge, who has a lot of power. Because as my friend Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And the great responsibility means that you need to take things seriously. And I think a lot of modern politicians are incapable of taking things seriously because they don't know anything. They're really ignorant. By the way, Plato famously said that ignorance is the root of all evil.
Oh.
So I can leave you with that thought to ponder. Plato, 2.5 millennia ago, argued that ignorance is the root of all evil, meaning that if you don't know what you're doing and why you're doing it, you're going to make blunders. You're going to do bad things. You're going to really make major mistakes. I think he was absolutely right.
Agree.
Excellent. Okay, that's all. Steve, thank you. Terima kasih. Terima kasih is how Minahasan said makasih, right? I assume that you're a Minahasan, if I'm not mistaken, Steve.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And Professor Massimo Pigliucci in English, thank you. And in Italian, it's grazie, right?
Grazie.
Yes, it is.